I am Rebecca Rose. I was born in Sydney, Unama'ki, and I grew up in Dartmouth, Bunamakwadi in Mi'kma'ki or Nova Scotia. I am a writer, an author, an activist, and a queer femme. So I went to school at what is now called Toronto Metropolitan University, TMU, in 2002, and I was there until 2009. I got involved in Rye Pride, as it was called then, pretty early. That was one of the first clubs that I joined, and it was essentially in a janitor's closet at the university. And then I found the Women's Center, and then I worked for the Women's Center, and then that's how I then got elected to the Students' Union. And then I moved back home to Nova Scotia to work for the Canadian Federation of Students, the national and provincial student movement in this country. And that's when I got involved with feminist and queer and trans organizing in Halifax, Jibuktuk. I came out to my close friends as bisexual when I was about 17. So my last year of high school, I went to Dartmouth High School. And then I came out to folks at Toronto Metropolitan University when I was there. And then I came out largely to my family when I moved home around 25. I had no problems coming out. My family is incredibly supportive. I was already organizing with the Dyke and Trans March, and so maybe that was a bit of a tell. And my friends were super supportive because I hung out with like high school leadership folks, and everyone at university was obviously supportive because I was involved with progressive student organizing. It's kind of like a core tenet. I would say I identify as a queer femme woman, but queer and femme are the words that I like best. So I'm technically still bisexual. I'm in a lesbian relationship, have been for the past 10 years, but I'm technically still bisexual. I like the word queer. I switched from bisexual to queer sometime in my early 20s because I like the word for a lot of reasons. I like how fluid it is and what an umbrella term it is. I like the political roots of the word queer. I like the reclamative roots of the word queer. And so I go with queer over bisexual, though technically I could be classed as bisexual as well, and that's fine. I'm interested and attracted to folks of lots of different genders. I definitely got teased when I was in university because I was identifying as bisexual, but primarily with cisgender men. And I had some folks who purported to be progressive, but would make fun of me and say I was bisexual until graduation or bug. And, say like, what's happening in the bisexual community this weekend, Rebecca. So it's kind of funny that I've ended up being such like a prominent kind of queer activist and voice. I really, really leaned into that identity. I moved back to Jibuktuk, to Halifax, to Nova Scotia in 2009 because I got a job with the Canadian Federation of Students. And the Canadian Federation of Students is a very queer and trans organization. The student movement is very queer and trans. There's lots of 2SLGBTQIA plus folks in leadership positions in students' unions in that organization. And so through the Canadian Federation of Students, they have a queer constituency group. And so every morning, all the constituency groups met first thing in the morning after you'd been up late the night before. And so the queer and trans constituency group would meet, and I would meet queer and trans folks from across the country who were student activists. And so I guess I kind of leaned into my identity partially through student activism. And when I was at Toronto Metropolitan University, we did a lot of campaigns around ending homophobia and transphobia. We campaigned for same-sex marriage, etc., etc., etc. So moving back home, I first got involved in feminist organizing, specifically a group called the Feminist League for Agitation Propaganda. And that was because the G20 was meeting in Halifax. And so there was a lot of anti-globalization activism happening in the city, but it was really being dominated by cis dudes, or manarchists, as we called them. And so a group was created for femmes and for women to organize where we wouldn't get talked over by the cis dudes. And the aim was for it to be women and trans folks, but it was mostly women and kind of one of my friends who was trans. And we created feminist literature on the G20, and we did different protests as well. We did some pro-abortion, pro-choice work. But a lot of the folks involved in the Feminist League for Agitation Propaganda were queer. I mean, I think just existing as a queer and trans person is activism, and so it's built right into our identity. And so you've already got one foot in the door when it comes to broader activism. I got involved in the Dyke and Trans March in Jabuktuk. And at first it was a Dyke March. So there were two folks, two women who went to Toronto, and they were a couple. They were a lesbian couple. And they went to the Dyke March there, and they were just like super moved by it, and they wanted to start one here. And so a group of us that were kind of involved in feminist organizing got involved in that organizing. And some of our main goals were to make sure that it was, women and trans only, as it was in Toronto, and that allies could, watch and support. And also that trans folks were involved. And so it morphed from the Dyke March, was supposed to be like a women loving women march, from that to the Dyke and Trans March. But then there were some folks, primarily some younger trans men, that didn't feel that it was really buy-in for them. They felt like it was a T-tack, like just tacking trans on, though there were specifically some older trans women. When I say older, I'd say probably 40s involved in the organizing. And so then there was a big discussion at Men's Bar, actually, about whether it would be a Dyke March or Dyke and Trans March. And there were quite a few trans folks there, and it was decided that it would just be a Dyke March that year. And then next year we would start from scratch and see what it would be. And the next year, I forget how many meetings we had before we decided that it would be Dyke and Trans. And we started kind of billing it as a radical queer march that was an alternative to corporate mainstream pride. And then it morphed into deciding that it would be Dyke and Trans March. So my first experience with pride festivals and parades was in Toronto, and that was through my students' union. And so I was first in the Pride Parade in Toronto probably at 18 or 19, because that was the first year I was elected to the Students' Union. I only went to watch my first Pride Parade last year. That was the first time I ever watched one. I've always been in them. And so my first experiences with Pride parades and festivals was in Toronto and was a part of the student movement. And we were really big on making sure that Pride remained political. Specifically, there were some attempts in Toronto to take groups out of the parade who were anti-Israeli apartheid. And there was a big lobby to block those groups from being in the parade. And so, because in the student movement we did Palestinian solidarity work, we were big on making sure that folks were able to participate in the parade and that Pride remained political and critical and all of those things. And so when I moved home, my first real interaction with Halifax Pride was because the chair had said that Pride needed to be more family friendly and less promiscuous. And so usually that's code for we need to make it more palatable for cisgender straight folks, because of course we have families. And so Pride is inherently family friendly, and a parade can't be promiscuous. It doesn't sleep with other parades. What he meant was, people were wearing too little clothing and being too sexual. But of course, Pride is always going to be sexual, and the movement for queer and trans liberation is always going to be sexual, because that's what it's about. It's about sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. And so a group of us that were young, mostly young queer femmes and trans folks, went to meetings, Pride meetings, and there was one at the Youth Project, a community meeting, and held them to task for those comments and also how corporate they had gotten. And so that was a real kind of flashpoint in Halifax and Jabuktuk around Pride. And that was my first interaction with them. So many thoughts and feelings about Pride. What's interesting is that I kind of cut my queer activist teeth opposing the commercialization and the mainstreaming of Pride. But I could do that because it already existed as kind of an institution by the time I came up. Whereas as someone that does 2SLGBTQIA plus history, I talk to folks in their 60s, 70s, and 80s who had to create prides from scratch and who have a different vantage point. And obviously not all those folks have the same opinion of Pride. So I can see Pride through a bunch of different lenses. I personally would like Pride to be a march and some community events. I mean, the way it was this year with all of the community events was amazing. What was missing was the parade or a march. And although there was a queer and trans march, unfortunately my car was hit by a bus on my way there, so I didn't get to go. But I like the idea of Pride proper organizing the parade, which I would like to see as a march, and maybe a few other events, and then the community organizing the other events, but that has to be funded. Folks need to get paid for their labor, which I think was a thing that was missing this year, or else folks will burn out. So that would be my ideal. My favorite part of Pride in Toronto was always the Dyke March, and then the Trans March, when the Trans March came around, because it was so grassroots and folks were marching and there were no floats and there were banners and there were chants, and it was, women and trans only, or trans and allies only. So those were always my favorite things in Toronto, and then the events that kind of surrounded Pride. And then here, my favorite was always the Dyke and Trans March, and then Rad Pride when it happened, and the community events as well. So that's what I would like to see. I don't think that Pride needs to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I think actually we need to pull back and probably shrink it down, and that's okay. Here in Jabuktuk, Take Back the Night is traditionally organized in recent days by South House, or what was the Dalhousie Women's Centre, and it's a feminist march to reclaim the streets for women and femme folks and I guess other gender diverse folks that are at disproportionate risk of sexual violence. And so it is the strength in numbers, and saying that there's so many of us that we can walk the streets at night without being at risk of sexual violence, but we should be able to walk the streets at night without risk of sexual violence. That, of course, has roots, though, dating back to the late 70s in Halifax. And so with my historian cap on, that came from the socialist group in struggle organized the International Women's Day, and then there was a anarcha feminist group that organized Take Back the Night or Reclaim the Night. And so here, the Dyke and Trans March was later adopted by Rad Pride, which was in part organized by South House. But it came out of the need to have an alternative to the corporate mainstream Pride Parade, and to have something that was focused not on cisgender gay men, but was focused on queer women, femme folks, and trans folks. Rad Pride kind of came after me, so I was involved in the Dyke and Trans March before it was being run by Rad Pride. And so I mostly went to Rad Pride events, and I spoke at one of the Dyke and Trans Marches that was organized by Rad Pride, but I am kind of a queer generation older than Rad Pride. I'd say if a queer generation is, like 5 years. So I got most of my nightlife out of my system in Toronto at a bar called Slacks, which was a lesbian bar in the Village, and it was the only lesbian bar in the Village, and I lived around the corner, and so I was in my early 20s going to Slacks, and it was glorious. When I moved home, I didn't really go to Reflections. My girlfriend is a Reflections baby, but I didn't really go to Reflections. I kind of missed that stage being in Toronto. I went to the Company House. And so the Company House was a live music venue on Gottingen, and it was owned by a lesbian couple. And so it was live music, but it was also kind of the de facto lesbian or queer woman bar. And so that's where I spent a lot of my time. Yeah. So I went to disco nights there, I went to retro nights there. I went to pretty much anything that was at the company house. Yeah, the company house was a big room. It had a sign out front that had a little canary with a coal miner's hat on, because one of the owners was from Glace Bay, I believe, Cape Breton at the very least. And so company house, of course, is a callback to the houses that the coal miners and their families lived in. And so there was this little canary with a miner's hat on. And there is a stage in the front left corner, and there was a bar on the right, and there was a whole bank of windows on the street, and there was a gender neutral accessible washroom in the back right corner, and then the rest of the washrooms, single stall washrooms, were downstairs. And it was just the only place you could go in town where there would be a majority of queer women, femmes, trans folks at that time. So when I was most active within the 2SLGBTQIA plus community in Jibuktuk, I didn't really go to reflections. I didn't really go to men's bar. At that time, men's and Molly's wasn't really a space where at least my generation of queer femmes and trans folks felt comfortable. After us, there were some folks that did drag shows there, and specifically genderfuck drag shows there, and so they kind of reclaimed it as a trans space, which was awesome, but that wasn't somewhere we felt comfortable. So having a space like the company house is and was important because that was an intergenerational space. I mean, if you went earlier, there would be many older lesbians who I might actually know who they are now that I've done the history work, but I didn't know them there. And when I say earlier, I mean like before 11 p.m. or midnight, because for some reason we thought that was an appropriate time to leave the house. And now I'm in bed by then for sure. But it was an intergenerational space, which was really special. It was run by a lesbian couple who was older than me, but most of the staff were about my age. And a lot of the folks that played music there and that DJ'd there were about my age, maybe a little bit older. So that was great. It's so important to interact with other queer and trans folks face to face, because that's where you actually get to know people as humans, and that's where you get to talk about what's happening in your lives, and that's where you get to talk about what's happening in the community, and that's where you get to debate things, and you have to see how that person reacts to what you say. And so as opposed to being online where you don't have to see that person's face or that person's body language, and so physical space is just so important. And being with all different types of people, all different ages, that's what I would say. A bar at the time, the Gay Alliance for Equality and Rumors were based on the idea of, so I think the importance of having separate 2SLGBTQIA plus spaces is really summed up well by this letter that was written in the early 80s and talking about women's nights at Rumors, which was the gay, lesbian, bi bar at the time in Halifax, called Rumors a coming separate from an oppressive heterosexist society and establishing a positive enclave for homosexual people. I think we need separate queer and trans spaces, 2SLGBTQIA plus spaces, because we need to feel like we're in the majority for once. We have to feel what it feels like to be in a sea of queer and trans people. We have to see what a society could look like where folks are more open about and accepting of gender and sexual diversity. And I think it only makes us stronger when we have those spaces. So when we have separate spaces, say for women and trans folks, when we have separate spaces for trans folks, when we have separate spaces for BIPOC folks, I think that only makes us stronger. Before the Parade was originally an article, and it was an article for The Coast, which was at that point a printed alternative weekly newspaper in Halifax, Jabuktuk. And I did an article about Anne Fulton, and Anne Fulton was a lesbian elder who passed, I believe, in 2015. And there wasn't a lot of fanfare around her passing because she had kind of retreated from lesbian, gay activism at that point in her life. But because I am close with Robin Metcalf, who has been involved in gay activism since the mid-70s in Halifax, Jabuktuk, and he was good friends with Anne because she was one of the founding members of the Gay Alliance for Equality and also lesbian organizing in this town. So APPO, the Atlantic Provinces Political Lesbians for Equality. I wrote an article about Anne for The Coast. And then when I finished that article, I thought there are so many other stories like Anne's that we should capture before folks pass. And so then I wrote an article called Before the Parade for The Coast. And it was either the longest or one of the longest feature articles that they had ever run. And so then Nimbus Publishing approached me to ask if I would do a book-length project. And so that became Before the Parade, the book. So first I wrote the article, and so I probably interviewed just over a handful of people. So that included Robin Metcalf, Deborah Trask, Lynn Murphy, Walter Borden, Lauren Izzard, Nancy Brister. And then after that, I kind of just expanded on that. And so Robin Metcalf has really been a mentor to me. We met at a Pink Triangle Day presentation that he was giving at Vithos, and we became friends. And I would go to his apartment in Halifax, and he would feed me half decaf, half caffeinated coffee and tell me about local gay, queer history. And I would kind of just store it all in my brain. And then when I was writing the book, I kind of started with him and the folks I had spoken to for the article, and then branched out from there. So Robin put me in touch with his friends and folks that he knew from the 70s and 80s, and then they put me in touch with their friends and lovers, and then they put me in touch with their friends and lovers. And then, you know, I got into the lesbian feminist world, and then the dams kind of broke, and then I found this whole amazing community of lesbian feminists. And really, I had to stop. I had a list of 80 to 90 people that I would have liked to speak to. And Andrea Curry is the last person I interviewed for the book. And then I had to stop because I had a deadline. And so I interviewed just over 30 two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer elders in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. And then also they gave me access to their personal archives, which is so special. And then I went into the Nova Scotia archives, which is where the Gay Alliance for Equalities and Gala's minutes are. And because my book is 1972 to 84, I read all the minutes from 72 to 84. And then I went into the Dalhousie Gazette, has a huge amount of coverage of gay activism in the city at the time, to the point that someone said, "What are you, the Dalhousie Gazette?" in a letter to the editor. They were really big allies, which I think is amazing. And I went into the Body Politic, which of course is the national newspaper for gay liberation in this country. I mean, there was a great document, the Lesbian Memory Keepers workshop came up with a document. So that was a group of lesbian women who were involved in the 70s and 80s, and they got together during a snowstorm and did kind of like a writing down of oral histories. And so I used that. I used Out Queer Looking, Queer Acting, which was Robin's catalog for the art exhibit of the same name. There was a booklet published in the 90s of all the different women's groups in Nova Scotia, and so I relied heavily on that because of course the crossover between feminist and lesbian and bisexual and two-spirit women organizing. Of course I relied also on Gay Halifax, the Halifax Rainbow Encyclopedia. That is a big jumping off point for me in most of my research. Researching and writing before the parade, it was so hard to narrow it all down. There's so much that's not in the book, and there's so much that quite frankly I forget now unless I'm going through my notes or going through my scans or my pictures of archival materials, because I didn't put it in the book, and so I'm not reading it all the time, referring to it all of the time. Someone asked me recently, how did you decide what you put in, what you didn't? Essentially, it was like if I had a first voice to speak to something, then I would put it in, but I wasn't going to put in something from the archives that I didn't have someone speaking about in an interview. And I had to weave all of those voices and stories together. I mean, as Robin says, a generation is not a monolith. And so while these folks might all be from the boomer generation, I mean, we have lesbian separatists and we have gay men, drag queens who, clashed at the time. We have folks in the middle, and I had to weave that all together. So I had to find the common, as Andrea Curry, who is a two-spirit indigiqueer person who was involved in the early 80s, said like her life was a bouquet. And so I think of the book and of the history as a bouquet, and everyone kind of contributed different flowers, and the bouquet is a little unruly, but it's beautiful. And so that's what I ended the book with, was that analogy, because I think it's a good analogy, and because I put the book out there, and then more people wanted to talk to me about the history. And so there's so much that's not in here that I've learned since, and that I kind of keep adding to the bouquet of local 2SLGBTQIA plus history.
There's like a weird...
Hi, love.
Oh, hello.
Nice wife.
Nice wife.
It's your nice wife.
That's my nice wife. Come give me a mooch.
Okay.
Hi. Oh my god. So sorry. Captured our relationship for posterity. At this point, there has been some work documenting local 2SLGBTQIA plus histories, but still there is so much work to do. And so there's a great deal of pressure on anyone that is doing that work because there's still so many folks that haven't been spoken to and still so many histories that haven't been recorded. Oh, so the walking tours, the local lesbian, gay, bisexual history tours came about because Jane's Walk, which is a local walking tour group, asked me to do one. I had previously been in talks with Pride about doing one, and that didn't materialize. And so I did the Jane's Walk, and then other folks asked me to do local lesbian, gay, bisexual walking tours, and I did one with Leslie Lowe, who wrote the book The Volunteers. And so Leslie spoke about the history of women volunteers during World War II in Halifax, and I spoke about the local lesbian, gay, bisexual history. And then I most recently did one for the Queer and Trans Choir Conference that happened in Halifax, which was a history-making event in itself. Much of the buildings that I talk about in the lesbian, gay, bisexual history walking tour in downtown Halifax, Chipuktuk, do not exist anymore. So some of the ones that do that are super important are the Carlton Bar, which was the jury room, which was where the second known lesbian, gay, bisexual picket happened. The Green Lantern building, which housed a lot of gay men in the early to mid 70s, as well as a few of the first gay bars, as well as some of the first Gay Alliance for Equality meetings, as well as the Gay Line, which was the gay phone line in the city, and the Turret, which is at 1588 Barrington, which was more recently called the Khyber Building, which was the home of the Turret Bar, which was the first bar run by the Gay Alliance for Equality. And so it was the first gay, lesbian, bi bar / community center where all of the funds were going back into the local activism and events. And so those buildings still exist. Forest House, a women's place, still exists, and so that's Langhouse now, and that was a women's center. The YWCA built women's center, and a lot of lesbians, bisexual women were involved in making that happen, and in the activism and the workshops that happened there. That still exists. Otherwise, a lot of the buildings are gone. But also, what's funny about queer and trans history is, of course, because folks weren't super safe to have sex in their own spaces because of, maybe they were married, maybe they lived with family, maybe their neighbors didn't know they were queer. And so a lot of sex, especially gay male sex, happened in public and happened cruising. And so a lot of queer and gay male history takes place on the streets of Halifax, Chipuktuk. And so the Triangle was a cruising spot. Graveyards were a cruising spot. Citadel Hill was a huge cruising spot. The public gardens, which some folks called the Pubik Gardens, was a cruising spot. The Halifax Common was a cruising spot. And so a lot of histories on the streets and the sidewalks and in the bathrooms of Halifax, on the beaches of Halifax. And then for queer women, lesbian women, bisexual women, you know, a lot of marches. So the International Women's Day marches, Reclaim the Night marches, a lot of those were run by lesbian, bisexual, two-spirit women. And so a lot of their history happened on the streets as well. So while some of the buildings have been taken down, so much of our history happens on streets and sidewalks that a lot of our history is still there. So for the tours, you know, sometimes I'm just like on the corner of two streets hollering about gay sex in the middle of the day in downtown Halifax. I mean, a lot of gay men talk about this in Before the Parade, which is how important sex and cruising and public sex were to building community. Because before there were spaces, and even when there were spaces, not everyone felt comfortable going into a gay bar. And so that's how folks were finding each other. So that's why when people say things like, we need to make the Pride Parade more family friendly and the Pride Parade needs to be less promiscuous, that's why folks bristle, because the history of our community is that we found each other through sex. And we can't take that away. I think what's cool about Halifax, Jabuktuk, and the Atlantic provinces overall is that because, you know, we don't have something like a 519 community center, which they have in Toronto, we have to build our own spaces. And so, you know, folks built the turret, which was the de facto community center at the time. You know, folks built Rumors. You know, later on, we built the Dyken Trans March. Folks built South House, Rad Pride. Folks built, you know, the Khyber Center. There was a lot of queer and trans community there. The Glitter Bean, Venus Envy, Cape and Cowl. And so I think because we're not a big city, because we're not a big province, because we're not a big region with a lot of resources already, we have to make do with what we have, and we have to create our own spaces and our own worlds. And so I think that's what's coolest about being 2SLGBTQIA plus in Nova Scotia and the Atlantic provinces. So I personally am in favor of defunding the police. I don't think that cops should be in pride parades. I think that they can attend and police the sidelines, which is their job at the moment. The modern day queer and trans liberation movement was birthed out of police brutality, and that wasn't that long ago. We're talking, you know, for Cooper's Donuts, for Compton cafeteria riots, for Stonewall, which were all riots against police brutality, which, you know, birthed the movement. And then Pride, that was the 60s, right? And late 60s, 69 for Stonewall. And then if we're talking about the bathhouse raids in Toronto, we're talking about the early 80s. And so it's very recent history. And so I just don't think it's appropriate for police to be in pride parades or involved in pride festivities at all. And also, you know, reading a book like Stone Butch Blues, which is a real touchstone for me. That's where I first kind of saw femme women and butch femme culture represented in fiction, and there's so much police brutality in that book. I just can't ever accept police involvement. As someone that studies local history and has spoken to lots of lesbian, gay, bisexual, two-spirit elders, I understand why people have different views on police in Pride or on corporations in Pride, as folks who built it from scratch and who were looking for support from anywhere. And I understand, like, you know, people ask me about the history of police and the gay, lesbian, bisexual community in this city in the 70s and 80s. And there weren't any police raids of our bars. There were definitely folks were escorted out of bars, like the jury room, by police for quote unquote being drunk and disorderly in public, because they couldn't be escorted out of the bar for being gay. But there were no police raids. There were police raids of bathrooms, just not of bars. What mostly I heard was police inaction when it came to gay bashings, and not taking folks seriously when they reported them. Police, you know, harassing folks who were cruising and kind of barking at them to come over, show them their ID, and then move along. Some folks involved in the Gay Alliance for Equality and the Turret worked really hard to try to have a good relationship with the police so that they didn't raid the space or antagonize the Gay Alliance for Equality. And I think the police and all the owners of the other bars and the liquor commission were all happy when the gays got their own bar through the Turret, because then they weren't frequenting quote unquote straight bars and making trouble there where the police would have to get involved. So I didn't know Raymond Tavel super well, just like generationally we were different ages, and I was a young queer woman and he was a gay man. The one memory that I have of Raymond Tavel that really sticks out is him being there at the end of, I don't know if it was the Dyke March or the Dyke and Trans March, and depending on what year it was, I don't know if we asked folks to kind of sit it out and support us or if we just asked them to kind of march at the back of the march, but he was there in support of the Dyke and Trans March. And so there's a really nice picture of us that Anita Teal Martinez took standing in what I think was the gravel parking lot across from the company house. And I think he was holding some flyers. And so just, you know, being an ally of queer femmes and trans folks is my main memory of him. I was in Fredericton when Raymond was killed, and so I missed like the vigil. What I remember most is all of the rainbow flags and all of the rainbow posters with Raymond's face on it, and the rainbow images with Raymond's face on it that folks made for social media. And that's kind of when my relationship with the rainbow flag changed, because I've always been kind of a pink triangle queer, because of its radical roots. But I always felt like the rainbow flag was kind of overused and didn't mean a lot because corporations, businesses put it up at Pride and then they take it down. But to see the rainbow flag up at businesses and homes and organizations after Raymond was murdered in a show of solidarity with the community was really touching and did change my relationship with the flag. This is like a RuPaul's Drag Race moment where they show you the picture of you and then you cry on the final runway. What would I say to baby Rebecca? I would tell my younger questioning self that there's already so much local 2SLGBTQIA plus history in this town and in this province and in this region. You come from a long line of queer and trans folks and queer and trans activists. I would say you're going to be involved in creating community in Halifax and Nova Scotia. I would say that you're going to find your possibility models, your elders, and that's going to change the course of your life. What's really interesting and eerie is that when we were living in Halifax on Northwood, I made kind of like a brainstorm of some different goals in my life, and some of them were like personal, like health goals and friend goals, and some of them were professional and activism related. And one of the things I wrote down was to develop relationships with my 2SLGBTQIA plus elders. And then so soon after that, I was doing this history work and writing articles and writing Before the Parade, the book. And it wasn't purposeful. It just happened that way. But having possibility models, knowing, that you can grow old as a queer and trans person, given all of the queer and trans death that we see, knowing that you can grow old and like contribute to your community, that you can kind of dip in and out of activism, and that you can still be an activist in your 60s, 70s, and 80s, that you can have loving and healthy and fulfilling romantic relationships and friendships and be involved in community. That's really what I got from my elders and my possibility models. Oh my goodness, the children. I mean, again, I think what I would say is that there's such a rich history of 2SLGBTQIA plus activism in Halifax, Jabuktuk, and Mi'kma'ki. I mean, Mi'kmaq folks, Two-Spirit folks have been here for like 13,000 years. But on top of that, like more recently, there is such a history of gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, queer, plus activism, community spaces, and you can learn so much from that. You can learn what you want to repeat and what you don't want to repeat. You don't have to reinvent things. Documenting 2SLGBTQIA plus histories is important because, as Alok Vaidmanan has said, who is a trans, non-binary, racialized artist, activist, author, etc., I have faith because I know what came before. And so if you don't know that trans and gender non-conforming people have existed forever, and in Mi'kma'ki, for 13,000 years, since Mi'kmaq folks have been here, then you can think that this is a new thing that's being, quote unquote, shoved down your throat, right? When really the gender binary and heterosexuality is the new thing. And so that's so important. The history is so documenting 2SLGBTQIA plus history is also important because without those histories, the history that's being presented is simply not accurate. The history that we learned in elementary through high school through university is just not accurate without 2SLGBTQIA plus history, or without Mi'kmaq Indigenous histories, without Black African Nova Scotian histories. Why else is history important? Local 2SLGBTQIA plus history is important because right now we're in a fight for our lives. We're fighting against increasing homophobia and transphobia and laws and policies that aim to erase us. And so we have to know how other folks have fought for their lives and how they have fought off those attacks to know what to do and what not to do.